Welcome everybody to the modernization of your law firm. Technology solutions you should be looking at now to ensure your firm is future ready. My name is Drew Blazitis. I'm joined by Eric Hunter of Bradford and Barthel. And today we really want to focus this session around a few things, three in particular. One, how firms can thoughtfully select and implement new technology solutions. Two, how future-ready technology will impact the workplace and personal efficiency. And three, how modernizing today will set your firm up for future advantages for years to come. So, Eric, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Hunter. I'm Chief Technology Innovation Officer with Bradford and Barthel. I head up the innovation department as well as technology. Innovation is there's a sub-team spherical models within Bradford Barthel that focuses on future trends, where things are going. My background is actually in jazz performance from school and ended up working in high tech after Intel, Oracle. And it's interesting how perspectives when you're younger tie in and then shape in where your career ends up going. And so a lot of the creativity from jazz, the improvisation, and a lot of the background in Intel from working in web and understanding kind of at the infancy of the web and where it was going, looking at the color palettes, how people are connecting to it, what's their motivations and so forth, really brought in a lot of different human behavior components that when I ended up transitioning into law from the International Legal Technology Association and now into Bradford Barthel with spherical models, all of that ties into an eye for innovation. Where are things trending? Where are things going? And we've really tried to bring that to the firm and to the different board appointments that I have here in the US, UK, EU, and Asia Pac regions.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. So just to recap, and I'm going to move us along here shortly, but to recap what we're focused on here today, we're really looking at a few different things, and what we'll cover is, again, threefold. So going through each of these 3 points and really recapping kind of how we can prepare ourselves, how firms should be thinking about the future going forward. So thank you for your background, Eric, and I'll give mine as well. So Drew Blazitis, I'm the VP of Product and Strategy at Fulcrum. Have been in this space, legal in particular, for about 7 years. Prior to that, worked at SAP. So always focus on the technology space and really focus on how we should be looking at the future. It's a very interesting industry, in particular, the growth, the challenges, the competition that's coming into play, and how this continues to evolve will be very special over the next few years. So when we look at how we view things, a lot of firms and a lot of conferences, and Eric, you can attest to this because we go to a lot of the same conferences, everyone tends to look at that top level of digital transformation and really want to jump to that peak. So when we think about how to start this journey, where to go, and a lot of what we're talking about here today is focused around building what we like to call a digital foundation. That's really where Fulcrum has focused our efforts. So a quick background on Fulcrum, and then we'll jump into more on the session. We've been around for quite some time. The Fulcrum GT focus since 2011 has been dedicated to the legal and professional services industries. We are headquartered in Chicago, although we are global, London, India, multiple locations being added every year as our client base grows, and continue to grow in our product suite as well. We really focus on core business operations within our digital business platform, which is now scaled and extended. So that platform becomes even more robust, more end-to-end, and gives firms the ability to create that digital foundation to then move up that pyramid. So we'll focus on that foundation, a little bit around the optimization and digital transformation of really how we can prepare and what we think might be coming. And Eric, that's really where you spend your time. That's where you're published. That's what you do is, where should we be thinking? Where should we be going? And how can we prepare ourselves? So when we go back into kind of where you think things are going, Eric, this is something you talk about. This is where you go, you speak around the world, people come to listen and say, okay, where should we put our focus and how can we think about preparing ourselves for what's to come? How would you frame that and where would you kind of bring your point of view into this as we start that journey?
We're at a really interesting point in time. It's a great question. And as we're coming out of pandemic, I think it's important to look at some of the way that the pandemic has focused a lens for the need for change on a lot of companies that may have been resistant before. And for those that were already ready, it's accelerating said change. A concept I like to speak around when looking towards the future is that we both shape and are shaped by our reality. And that may sound redundant, but when you look at that, that is actually a big key in perception-based technologies. Technologies that, for example, we're working with right now. We're currently doing this Zoom interface, two-dimensional video interface. It's something that people have been using over the last year. The interesting thing, this is technology that's more than a decade old, right? And there's a whole lot of investment being put into things like augmented virtual realities that before have been either specialized towards gaming or scientific research, medical engineering capabilities, areas where we just didn't have the bandwidth to deploy with something like this. But now, with the upgrading of connectivity, with 5G, some of the different satellite systems being put in place by Musk, Bezos, and others, enhanced broadband to different areas all over the globe, we're really getting to a point where we can start to take advantage of some of these perception-based technologies. Again, where if we were to be having this meeting, but having in a way where we could go ahead and set a room for both Drew and I and those that would attend. It could be anywhere. It could be in Venice. It could be in Australia. It could be in Austria. It could be outside or inside. And before, when I would talk about this, before pandemic, some people would get it, others would laugh. Like, why in the world would that matter? But after a year where we're all within an environment where, dang it, I really wish I could get out, I would actually really appreciate what that extra experience with nature, whatnot, would bring to something like this, where you have more senses, sight, sound, taste, et cetera, right? You can feel the wind over wherever you're going to be. That brings a different layer of creativity, a different approach to problems. And I think it's really heightened that type of understanding across the globe. So we're talking about where we're going. You, of course, have elements of machine learning, these augmented kind of capabilities that we need with data analytics through the different type of environments we're all connecting with. But I think you're going to have this mixed reality augmentation taking place as well.
Yeah, it's something I've heard you talk about before, and that reaction that we've seen from people is, yeah, I don't know if we'll get there, but coming out of this year and really seeing how it could be applicable, I'd really love to see that talk that you've done multiple times, a couple of years ago, that's grown and adapted. Have that same talk come to a conference and hear how people react. Oh, that would be great. I'd love to be sitting at a table with peers around the globe instead of just one-dimensionally looking at people. So it's always interesting to get your perspective on that side of it. And when we look at a few of the things you talked about there, obviously the augmented reality, the kind of components that you could bring in there. You also touched on things like machine learning, AI, NLP, bringing in technologies, very buzzwordy type of things we hear at conferences that we speak at. And I'm a critic as well of myself. I do bring that into quite a few conversations as well. But when we look at it from kind of how it started for Bradford and Barthel, right? You have this grand vision with the rest of your executive team of how you want to lead, how you want people to get there. And my job oftentimes, as you joke, is to bring you back to reality a little bit. So if I could do that here and make us take a step back and say, Eric, if we're going to get to those points in the future and you want to enable the remote workforces, become more fluid in your working dynamics and even run your business as smooth as you want it to, how did you set that up? And I guess that's kind of the invention or starting point of how Fulcrum and Bradford became strategic partners. Could you kind of take us through how that vision started, where you were thinking, I think at this point it might have been 4.5, 5 years ago, to put in this platform for change, be an early adopter in your industry to move to the cloud, and why those things were important to your business and the business of Bradford and Barthel?
Absolutely. It's interesting, as with a lot of these elements, it started with failure. And so for those in the audience, they're going to be attempting to do things. Failure can lead to good things. And we started by moving into collaborative cloud. We wanted to be in this collaborative cloud machine learning environment 11 years ago. And I was convinced it was going to happen so fast. And there were these older colleagues of mine, across the globe that were much wiser, saying, actually, Eric, it's going to take a lot longer than you think. Firms aren't going to change that quick. It's like, no, you're wrong. It absolutely is. And it was, and I was dead wrong. And so what ended up happening is that by the time we came up to engage with your team, we'd had a number of failures and successes. We had gone with Google for Business as a cloud type of operation, tried to bring in some different cloud partnerships, and we're just really slow in getting there. We had a financial application that we were working with, couldn't really plug into what we wanted to have from this intelligent collaborative cloud environment. The field just wasn't ready for it. And so, the legal industry rather. So I kept trying to look outside of where legal was, because a lot of that's my background, being in high tech outside of legal, to see what kind of partnerships we can bring in. We really tried to form a partnership with Google and bringing that to where we were going. And then we started piecemealing in different companies we could look in to fit. So when we look at a player, for example, like Fulcrum, that has partnerships with SAP, SAP backed. Our CFO has a background in manufacturing, also outside of legal. Really love this idea of what the power of SAP could bring, but with Fulcrum essentially being this legal prism to funnel it through and be able to give through a lot of the things that we're looking at, things like intelligent analytics, visual analytics, machine learning, these kind of capabilities, and say, okay, how can we end up having this research and development partner be there for the long term? One of the ideas with Google was, look, we can never approach the R&D budget that Google has, but if we're partnered with them from a client relationship as far as use case, and we can show, look, what we're looking at, others will look at within industries as well, then there's a lot of response. And that was the strategy in bringing in, all right, we're going to switch financial applications, the way that we run analytics. We were using Tableau before, and we replaced that as we ended up working with Fulcrum and coming in with the different deployment applications and so forth. And the other element that I'll have to say with this is that when you're looking at some of these, when talking about grand terms like collaborative cloud and so forth, another mistake that I made that led to the relationship we have was I had assumed that if we're using consumer-based technologies, it will naturally make end users more efficient. I just assumed that was the case because they're built to be behavioral adapting. But what I ended up finding was if you do that in an organization, it will actually behavioral adapt bad habits as opposed to making them more efficient as well. So we needed to have a process initiative put in place. Our managing partner led that, coordinated with different members of the executive team. So I'd say by the time that we met 4 or 5 years ago, Drew, we were very primed for, okay, we've had some successes, we've had some failures, but we really need a partnership to deliver the last piece of this vision. And it actually is the most important piece, because it's the heart of our financial system. It's the heart of where attorneys will capture time. And it's also the heart of the primary disruption facing the legal industry, as in how are businesses doing business, how are law firms approaching business, how are they going to be approaching business, and how is the attorney-client relationship going to shift over the next 10 years?
Yeah, and again, thanks for sharing the experience. I know it's always interesting for people to hear kind of war stories of what worked, what didn't, how it led you to this path. And I think that approach to where did you want to be, this started 10, 11 years ago, as you said, then evolved over the course of time, brings you to that next step and understand, okay, where do we start? Where do we go? And that's really the basis of this session is, and I'll get to this in a minute, but where does that then position you for growth going forward? And how does that impact your thread? So we've talked a lot about how that's grown, how it's become, more efficient. And you talked a little bit about the selection process of how you got to that point, right? Understanding your firm's goals, where you wanted to go, the dynamics in the industry, but it also comes with a bit of vision, right? It's not just follow the pack type of mentality. And what we often like to joke about in our side of the house from the vendor perspective is by the time you're thinking about it, it's almost too late. So if you've gone through the process the last time you went through an implementation and it hasn't been supported or upgraded, and now you're thinking, it might be time to make that move, you're probably already a little bit behind in thinking about how that can propel your firm to the next step. And I'll let you elaborate on that in a second, but having that foundation to build off of where it's fully supported, not going to deteriorate or fall in kind of that laggard category, but is always being invested in and promoted. I think that's what's going to help, again, move up that pyramid and hit the optimization and then the true transformation in the long term for things like you talked about of, attorney-client interactions and augmented realities and AI and machine learning becoming a part of it. So in the way that things were done and the way that you kind of came to that analysis. I think we've done enough of these panels before where people say, hey, this is all great. You're talking about all these great end results and you've seen efficiencies, you've done this, you've done that. But Eric, how do we even start that process, right? Where do we go? How do we understand, point A to point Z? How would you recommend someone starting that path and that journey to go from, we know we need to do something or we want to do something, to finding the right partner, implementing, and hitting those goals and targets for their firm?
Sure, it's a great question. It starts with an innovation initiative, I think, within the organization and the executive leadership team. You take a generic term like innovation, but there's a reality behind, all right, we actually want to look 3 to 5 years ahead. We might need a partner to help us see 3 to 5 to 10 years ahead, and then establish a culture around trying to get to some of these different elements. The other area to think about is also understanding the nature of your business, looking at it in a very just fact-based perspective. For example, with Bradford and Barthel, we're a very high volume, low profit margin business. So we are extremely sensitive to environmental change within our practice area. And therefore, when we look at trying to form technology partnerships and process innovations and have them move hand in hand, and then take a look at that and say, well, look, actually, we need to be able to do two things. We need to be able to protect the level of client service and the quality that we give. But we have to keep in mind, since we are very high volume and low profit margin, we have to be very sensitive to the costs involved, both in the venture and the R&D and what we're trying to achieve after. And after that, and within all that comes with trying to put together extremely tangible or very tangible benchmarks, things that aren't, and I'll dive into that just a little bit, in that you can come up with benchmarks from an executive leadership standpoint, but then when you dive into how people really work and you start to measure what they're really doing, you can find that, okay, these benchmarks are arbitrary because the reality is somewhere else. To measure that reality of something else, you need the tools to get there. And so I think from having this area, everything I'm describing, that's the starting point, saying you've diagnosed different pain points, and then you need to work with a partnership to help come in and say, okay, we can help assist in some of those pain points. This is where we're going. This is where we're funded. These are some of the different partnerships that we have. How do our futures align together? So I think as a starting point, Drew, that's where I would say as an organization, getting to that step, that collective step is key, and before engaging with the different technology solutions or process solutions you're looking for.
Yeah, and that's one thing we really appreciated from the relationship with yourselves, is that executive alignment came to the table very early on and was engaged throughout the entire project and had that vision, had the support. Not saying it stayed exactly the same from day one to where we are today. It continues to evolve and grow and change. But when you think about what we're talking about here today, modernizing a firm continues to evolve every year. As we've pointed out, COVID has dramatically shifted the way people work. It's shifted the way people deliver solutions and cater to client needs and adapting industry dynamics. So having that executive buy-in, having that alignment, and have that through the process from all different angles. You touched on multiple, and that's what I was writing down over here, is you had people from the client-facing side, the partners, those who are delivering service. You had technology with yourself and your team within the table, the CFO, and multiple others who have brought their opinions. So you're bringing that together to really understand holistically, how can we build this platform out for future growth for everybody, not just in a silo. But it does take that rigor and emphasis on need, want, and then nice to have down the line, right? So you knew it immediately, here are the things that we can do to streamline, optimize our business and take it to the next level, which then in turn allowed us to reinvest what we saved, optimize and reposition our people so they can deliver service in a different way, or just giving people more time back in their day to do what they're supposed to be doing, which is giving your clients great service, which is what you're known for. So all of those were really great points. And one thing you pointed out, it reminds me of a book, and I'm forgetting the name at the moment, but you said, take a hard look at yourselves and be honest in what you're good at, what you're not good at, and where that will take you. And the exercise it reminded me of was, I think it's called the kill the company exercise, right? Put yourselves in a room, think about, if we were the competition, how would we attack Bradford and Barthel or Fulcrum GT in this case, and really think about, if they deliver this product to market, how could we react? If they're able to change pricing, how can we put ourselves in a position to be competitive? So it's a really interesting point of that self-reflection of your organization to drive what could then be, technology and investment to help your firm become competitive in that landscape. So it's a very interesting, thought. And the piece that I really like of the practicality in the selection process that you went through is you're a man of very big vision, right? We've talked about a lot of things that you can jump to and move to, but you're very pragmatic in the approach of, I know we need a baseline and a foundation to operate off of. And that will then take us to this vision that you're typically 5, 6, 7 years ahead of the rest, but it will get you there and it will bring you kind of to that point. So in that process, there was a lot of discipline. And that's something I wanted to talk about, of it's always looking towards the end result. And this is going to change so much. And there's a lot that goes into technology, but people is always a central component. So how did you and the executive team bring that strategic clarity to the table, outline kind of how you're going to stay disciplined, and then ultimately keep your eye on that goal of why you are investing in this so you are prepared for the future?
It's a great question, and a key component to it, I'd have to say, lay with our Chief Training and Development Officer, and that he had spent 10 years abroad plus in Japan, and coming back had a lot of different methodologies in approaching towards training the associate attorneys, managing attorneys throughout the different 13 offices that we have. And a lot of his perspective is around bonus, profitability, client service. And in that case, he works hand in hand with our Chief Marketing Officer, and she just has a fantastic vision of client engagement, both from the person-to-person perspective, that handshake, a lot of the things you can't do during pandemic and then have to shift during pandemic with different types of client touch and deployment. So if you can have those two, the Chief Technology and Development Officer, Chief Marketing Officer, and then bring in our Chief Financial Officer, who, again, as I mentioned, had that background in manufacturing, came from outside of legal. Those three really worked together and trying to say, okay, we want to actually augment the way that we're currently doing things. We want to measure the way our attorneys are doing things in ways we haven't been able to before. And we want to bring in the lean process initiatives throughout the whole process that our managing partners champion. So to give a specific example of this, this team noticed that you go down to individual behavior, in this case, let's say an attorney, and you focus on them trying to meet goals of achieving bonus. They actually found that, well, if one attorney does, that actually helps lead towards the office achieving goals of bonus. That helps get waterfall across other offices achieving bonus. And you start to see this play out within the executive leadership and review month by month. So we found if we're actually starting to change behavior with one, change behavior with two, change behavior with three, that again has that has a momentum behind it. And that ended up bringing together extremely tangible results. So you have this vision of, or this problem of like, okay, high volume, low profit margin business. But if we focus on bonus, which then it'll benefit, we have enhanced client service, but we also have enhanced profitability, and the attorney themselves are empowered by going after this target. We are actually able to achieve this across all 13 offices, and we've able to reach a new norm as far as the level of profitability, client satisfaction that we've had across the board. And this is what key aspect of this has been. Let's form a partnership. Again, in this case, with Fulcrum as our solution, back with SAP, and then also with the different visual analytics in play to make these measurements possible, make the different type of behavioral modifications possible. And I'd say from that vision to the buy-in from the board, having the individuals involved see the benefits themselves as they're going along, that's been a huge success. And it's only been building over the last 3-4 years.
Very good points. And the one thing it really circles around, and I circled it on my page as well, as data, right? Everyone talks about the extreme volume of data, consumption of data, but it only does so well if you can actually leverage it hone it and put it into your practice where it's either driving behavior, it's corollary to behavior that the firm has, and it's used to advance the firm. And in this case, it was tracking, having visible, tangible, and monetary budgets or targets for individuals to hit, where that data needs to come from somewhere. It needs to be reviewed, analyzed, budgeted, projected, and then put in front of the people who ultimately bring the money in the door. So we really need to think about going forward, in my mind, technology as a tool, always a topic that's at the forefront from our side as a technology provider. But in listening to clients and listening to people like yourself talk about it, there's still that human element to it. And there's the need to make sure that what we're working off of, in this case, data as a foundational object for a lot of what we do, pretty much everything we do in the industries that we operate, are we able to access it? Are we able to do what we want with it? Are we going to have the clean data, the volume of data, the mobility of data between clouds, accessing it through different tool sets to even put ourselves in a position to succeed? And I think the classic adage here is garbage in, garbage out, right? You're going to put a lot of money into fancy and shiny new toys at some point in the future. And this might be a war scar or a lesson for people going forward, is if you want to jump to that shiny toy, make sure everything else is in place before you do so. And I think that's where your firm, among others that we've started to work with, have succeeded, is keeping your eye on where you want to be, how you're going to get there, and then figuring out what's going to really kind of transform the firm. And in the transformation, one of the things I think everyone is dealing with, and we've talked about it a few times, is the change that the pandemic has brought upon this industry in particular, but broader. There's a large audience that will be part of this session that isn't just legal focused. But your last point was a great one of coming down to people, the changes in behavior, the adaptability of seeing someone's results that could have that waterfall effect within the organization. So this is obviously a topic near and dear to your heart, changing in the workplace, human behavior, and how that's going to evolve. And I think everyone right now is figuring out, even at the executive level, are we bringing people back to the office? Do we have an office to bring them back to? What is our policy going to be on travel? How is that going to impact their business? So we'd love to get your thoughts on where is that going? What have you heard from peers in the industry, and how can technology play a part in that going forward? Because personally, I think it's here to stay with a very remote working model. Travel is always great, and that personal touch will need to be there, but I think we'll see it slowly come back more and more towards the work from home model. So would love to get your thoughts there.
It's a great question. It's an interesting perspective forward on what we're looking at. I, throughout the pandemic, have thought we'd be coming back into more of a hybrid model, where in some cases, take companies like Google, for example, where they'll have a lot of employees, and you could almost argue in some ways siloed in the past, only in that a certain subset of what they're delivering might be centered in Silicon Valley, in Mountain View or San Francisco, but then another form of the business will be based in New York, or you might have a unit over in Israel. And so you have these different elements across the globe, and a big part of that creativity comes from the people coming together. And there's that collaborative type of perspective, that creativity that comes with the development. And so you have some of these different high-tech companies that I think have allowed this remote work, but because of the nature of that business, saying, only so much can be done through this. We're not with that augmented virtual reality element yet, where we could perhaps have that same type of knowledge sharing. And I think that some companies that are coming after that type of creativity, they're looking to have that kind of collaboration. I think you just have to think there's the concept of the knowledge cafe, where some of the best way to exchange knowledge and creativity doesn't necessarily come in the boardroom or the meetings, but it's in the hallways outside, or it's in the dinners that you end up having with colleagues and so forth. Things that are in some ways missed from remote work. Another perspective I would say to bring into this that I would urge Shiporji Palanji did over in India. I was there with him with a generation, an older generation with a certain set of focus, younger generation of leaders with another set of focus. And between these two, they ended up knowingly, strategically saying, look, they're a huge conglomerate with a lot of subsidiaries under them. They focus on construction, but their perspective was, we know we're going to have different perspectives across the generations. We want you to work with both groups, then we'll combine them together and see what we can come up with. And so in doing that, that perspective happened to be around augmented reality use case, designing bridges, these kinds of things, but challenges were connectivity. Where I'm going with all of this is when we're looking at some of this remote work to augment the way you and I are currently coordinating, talking right now, we need to have there's connectivity realities that need to come up into play. Companies need to have that foundation line ready that you alluded to earlier. The other side of it, I think, is also from a perspective that I'll also advise companies in that when they end up implementing technology, the technology is very important to augment the best of what they do, in some cases disrupt what they do. But if they become overly reliant on it and they leave out that human touch that I alluded to, I think that they're going to be missing out on some key components of client interaction. That's why I think it's more of a hybrid environment. And I wanted to go in that level of detail because a hybrid environment answer sounds generic, but there's a whole lot of layers to it, because then there's decisions of, well, we're not going to have that face-to-face as much as we did, but we still have to. When? We're going to be coordinating with our clients face-to-face sometimes, but other times we're going to be using this type of delivery system. Or we need to have our executive leadership meetings and team building and these kind of change process meetings. But when? How often per year now? And are we going to put more thought into where it is? Because the environment shapes thinking, as high-tech companies have found with their campuses. And that's also good examples, I think, is to look at what some of the different players are doing. What's happening in finance? What are some of the strategies with those companies in bringing the workforce back? Is it hybrid altogether or none? And then looking at high-tech, who are the companies? Amazon, Google, Microsoft, what are their perspectives? How are they bringing them back? What are their strategies? Is it this fall, 2021, and so forth? And I think looking around where others are going, I think we'll end up, that gives a lot of feedback and balance to, hey, we're saving a lot of money by having people remote. We're really cutting down travel. That's saving costs to actually, if you spend the money to have the people interact, you'll end up getting a better product down the line, more creativity, R&D, meet and meet. So that's, I know more of a long answer to it, Drew, but want to try to answer it fully. Because again, there's a lot of layers to it. And it's a pretty exciting time when we end up looking at, I think, questions that nobody really has the answer to yet. We're all trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and it's really going to shape a lot of stuff, even the technology providers that we see coming into the space, and how they will impact how we all work, how we're going to be interacting and engaging with clients like yourself. So it's going to change. It's going to be interesting. I do think we're getting close to time here. So there's two questions that I wanted to wrap up with here. One of them is a fun question we always have to answer when we sit on a panel is, will AI be stealing all of the lawyers' jobs? Is blockchain here to stay? And the typical buzzword things that people want to hear about. But before we get to that, if you could boil it down to really two, three things that you think people should think about when we're evaluating, what are the solutions and how can you prepare yourselves to be ready? What are those couple pieces of advice? And then we'll get to that fun question last of, how are we going to prepare ourselves for what's to come?
You got it. As far as the preparedness level, again, it's that touch on where are we as an organization? And do we need help on an innovation perspective, on giving a sense of disruption? That's you have to take a look at it. This is where we sit. Are we ready to start taking a look at some of these solutions? If the answer is yes, then it's a matter of taking, okay, what is our process initiative we're going to have in place? What's our strategy to be changing hearts and minds and readying the organization for what's going to have to be an adaptation to change? And again, these elements, I think they sound simple, they sound no-brainer, sound duh, of course, but that's where so many companies stumble because they don't have this foundation. And I know you've seen it, I've seen it, where people, they'll throw a ton of money at a solution without having this foundation laid, and inevitably things will fall apart because the company wasn't on the same page from that executive leadership team on this is where we are and where we're trying to go. But we have to really look at where we are. And if we need help in deciding to where we need to go, then let's do it. Let's bring in outside perspectives, vet them, decide what works best for us, and then go forward, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And to play off of that part and take us to the piece that everyone, probably was hooked in for the section title of, There's solutions that are out there. There's tons and tons of money being put into groundbreaking next level technologies, whether it's around quantum computing, whether that's around a lot of the stuff that you've talked about of the augmented and virtual reality components. I still think blockchain, outside of those Doge coins and stuff that we see popping up, still has a very big impact on what we could see from a industry that we operate in, legal perspective, smart contracts and the like. But even at a base level of things that have been around for a while around cloud computing, cloud is still not something in our industry that's widely adopted. And in many industries, people still maintain that. But as these providers have grown, they put so much money in and are advancing that field so far, really have to ask the question of ourselves sometimes, is that a core competency of what we want to do? Do we need the people ourselves that need to manage that, and how that impacts? So from my perspective, I think cloud, AI, general term, of course, AI, but machine learning, digital assistant type of technology to make our interaction and experience with work easier. And then blockchain, from my perspective, I think still has quite a bit of viability in the industry that we operate. But you're the guy here. We want to hear from you. What are your thoughts?
I'll start with the perception-based technologies I began with, just an answer on that. Thinking again with our industry within legal, practical applications being, let's say we're coordinating with a partner like Fulcrum. I'm an attorney. We have our monitors, but when you start using the mixed reality augmentations, you don't need them as much. You can throw up the different screens you're working on the wall in front of you, or you can have them in different areas. It'd be like we're having this conversation, but you and I are throwing up different points. And if everyone's in that room in a three-dimensional way, they can see what it is we're talking about. And you can see that there's different workflow opportunities, different ways of approaching problems. And from a development standpoint, all kinds of opportunities. The next thing I'll follow up on is, let's say it's in trial and discovery. So if you're presenting evidence and the jury's looking at evidence, if you could actually have them be immersed in the environment of where the evidence is, let's say, for example, it's criminal law. There's something much more powerful of bringing them to the actual recorded evidence area there from a 3D perspective. It sounds sci-fi, it has been, but it's not going to be anymore. And with both of these points, there's already companies working in this area. Now, as far as machine learning and AI, what's a really interesting point there is what happened last year with OpenAI. Microsoft did this huge investment, $1 billion, in getting what was supposed to be this open sourced area. Kind of was, kind of wasn't, but I think ended up giving a very specific direction of, we're going to look at more of this generalized AI and put a lot of investment behind it and try to find applications where it can plug in. So I think in that case, where a lot of our technology partners, I know Fulcrum included, will have machine learning elements within it that augment as we go. And so you have this incremental change. But investments like that are after more of that transformational change. And that's where you come into this high performance computing backed elements that can be cloud-based delivering these solutions. Quantum is interesting because the environments still have to be so cold, right? I mean, when you're looking at physics, you have Einstein theory of relativity, things are very broad. You're looking at the quantum level, things get very tight. To work with things that small, you have to have an extremely cold environment. So you have this quantum supercomputer, and right now, they're able to do quantum algorithmic programming, organic chemistry, these different elements, but still haven't been able to get to where you could take a look at it blows the doors off, but that's actually something where the potential is definitely there. But again, if it does, we would then have to look at what's the delivery system. It all comes down to, can that delivery work across the level of connectivity we have now? And the last thing I'll touch on then with blockchain, although the finance coin aspect of it has been in the press so much, the interesting components can be, again, as if you're looking at organizations, you're looking at different data points. Let's take medical. You have an MRI, you have one copy of the MRI, you have it within the chain itself. Oftentimes within systems, there'll be different copies of this, that, and the other. You'll end up having within this one area that can communicate to the rest, and you leave it alone. Again, we could have a whole session topic on that, so I'll leave that for the moment. But the elements that I think are fascinating with blockchain, we haven't really quite discovered yet on how much that could revolutionize and disrupt the way that documents are shared, worked, and the nature of collaboration that we currently have. So, but to touch on all the points you just mentioned, I think all of those as a cohesive whole, we're gonna be having a lot of substantive change over the next 3, 5, 10 years. Again, because I think the pandemic has whet the appetite and shown that spotlight on dang, companies have seen pain points all over the place and they've got to scramble. Or folks have been innovating, and technology providers like yourself and the partnerships you're forming are saying, look, actually, we need different partners. We want different levels of innovation. We're seeing from the service provider standpoint, different areas we may want to be able to show our clients a spotlight on areas they may have been missing, if all of that makes sense.
It does. It does. And as you said, we could jump into every nook and cranny and really get into it. But I think that's part of, the conversations we like to have offline and see what we can do on those type of things. So I think we're almost at time. If I could wrap it up and try to summarize what I've heard from you and even a little bit of the perspective that we have from Fulcrum, don't stop thinking about it. Always be thinking about where things are going, challenge your own perspectives, think about how things will change, not only for yourself, but for the industry and the world at large. At this point, we saw how much that could be shaken by the pandemic. So think about those things. It's never too early to get started. It's actually probably already too late for a lot of people, but start working on it. It's okay to fail. You gave us a great example of, some of what you've gone through and how you've overcome that, worked through it, and now you're getting to that point that you wanted to be. So start with it, figure it out, build that proper foundation, and then keep evolving and growing. Bring in the right people, have the conversations, and think about what's going to be most impactful to the business, and really just keep building and growing, because it's a ever-changing world, ever-changing set of industries, and really need to focus on technology as the enabler. It comes down to the people, right? You're making the decisions, your team are the ones who are driving things forward. Technology will be the enabler, but if you do it right, it can definitely be helpful. So appreciate your time as always. Really appreciate jumping on. It's always fun to talk to you and have these conversations. So again, really appreciate everything. Again, to ACG for allowing us to have this conversation. A reminder to those in the audience, we have a networking session that's following the event. So if you are interested to stick around and have the time, please feel free to do so. And also, if you have any interest in following up about Fulcrum or Bradford and Barthel, we will share all of the information to get in touch with us. So Eric, thank you. We will talk again soon. And that is it for today.
Thanks so much, sir. Pleasure to be here.
Okay. Talk to you soon.